Hello, everyone. I know people are coming in. We'll just give it about a minute as people are trickling in online. Thank you for being here. All right. Well, welcome to Fresno Pacific Social Work Department Learn at Lunch today. And my name is Dr. Sonia Medina Pranger. I am the Social Work Department Chair and the MSW Program Director here. And Kim Leaner is our field director who normally is facilitating our Learn at Lunch, but she gave me the opportunity to do this today. So here I am. Just want to let you know that we do hold these Learn at Lunches quarterly. And so our next one will be in February. You should be able to get a notice on the date and topic coming soon to your email. Just know that if you've already signed up for our Learn at Lunch, then there is no need to do that again. You're already registered in the Learn at Lunch series. So again, I want to welcome you, welcome our guest speaker, and I'll be giving a bio introduction here. But just thank you again for joining us. We really are very thankful that we get to have this opportunity to connect with our partners out in the community to bring in their expertise to provide more learning and opportunities for growth in the field of social work. So without further ado, I do want to mention that we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we also will be recording this session. You should have received a notice about that. And so I will now introduce our title of presentation and guest speaker. So the title is A Mindset Upgrade, Trauma Informed 2.0. Our guest speaker is Jason Williams. Jason was born and raised in Fresno, California, and has a master's degree in psychology. After 20 years of working in local nonprofits and the Department of Social Services Child Welfare Division, Jason co-founded Brainwise Solutions. Brainwise is a community-based organization that is focused on personal and professional growth through conversations based on neuroscience and the importance of relationships. Jason's time spent working with children and families involved in the child welfare system did expose him to the challenges of trauma-exposed children and adults and led him to develop curriculum and strategies to help professionals and families build resilience and thrive. Brainwise Solutions has trained over 2,000 individuals, including educators, parents, social workers, attorneys, clinicians, foster parents, judges, and students. Brainwise Solutions now also offers healing modalities that include yoga, movement classes, meditation, and sound baths at their Fresno office. And again, I want to welcome our wonderful guest speaker, Jason. And before we start, I apologize. I forgot to open us up in prayer. If you don't mind, I will do that. And then I'll have Jason take it away. Okay. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to be together, to be able to gather, to hear about better ways to serve our clients, to serve ourselves and our families around trauma-informed practices, God. I thank you for Jason and how he's, passionate about this topic, wants people to hear this so that there's healing, God. And I just pray that we would have open hearts and open minds today to receive whatever the knowledge is that we need to continue to do this work in a way that glorifies you, God. Thank you for this opportunity together. And we ask this in your name. Amen. All right, Jason.
Great. Thank you, Sonia. Really appreciate it. Let's see. I am curious. So I'm not going to be able to see folks necessarily, but I'll keep an eye on the chat. Okay, because I did have a couple questions along the way, but it'll work. All right. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I am going to share my screen and we will dive in. So as we said, the topic, the conversation for today is called A Mindset Upgrade, Trauma-Informed 2.0. My name is Jason Williams, and I am the founder of Brainwise Solutions. Very glad to be here thankful to be asked to be here for this conversation. I founded Brainwise in 2020, and it's been really interesting to see the development of the trauma-informed work that we've been doing and the trauma-informed work that's been going on across the nation and across the world. And as I've had conversations with folks, I've really come to this realization, I think, that trauma informed is becoming kind of a buzzword. And so I really wanted to have a new conversation about how we talk about trauma and how we talk about neuroscience, and hopefully continue that conversation, but maybe from a new perspective and a new mindset. So let's dive in here. It's always fun figuring out how to navigate Zoom all over again. Okay, so the elements that we're going to talk about, generally speaking, are these three that you see on the screen. So I really want to distill information and distill neuroscience. And so a catchy phrase that I came up with is neuroscience for normal people. So we're going to talk a little bit about the brain and neuroscience, but I really want it to be a conversation and a basic conversation. We don't necessarily need to know all the parts like the amygdala and hippocampus and all these things. For some of these conversations, we can just have a more of a normal conversation. The other element that we're going to talk about, this is really what I've landed on with Brainwise. These three ideas: experiences matter, relationships matter, and words matter. And so I encourage you to take those three ideas and really look at everything through that lens of experiences, relationships, and words. And I'm going to go a lot deeper into that later on. And then one of the overall things that I really want to focus on is starting with this idea of individual healing. A lot of people are on their own healing journey. And what I really want to lift up is the idea that, yes, individual healing is vital to these conversations. And I think the next part of the conversation really should be about community healing and systems change. How do we change the systems that we're involved in? One of the things that I learned about when I worked at CPS, at the Department of Social Services, is that it's this big bureaucratic system, and it has such an important job of getting involved with families and children, and um, the systems that are involved in that system because of the nature of a whole human, like education and health. Each of those systems has an impact. And from my perspective, I really wanted to look at how do we help those systems do a better job overall. Because I think we could all think of an example where systems have failed people. And I saw a lot of that when I worked at CPS. I saw a lot of kids who would go through the CPS system and they wouldn't necessarily be better after that experience. Or the education system, right? We have kids that don't graduate, that don't go on to college or don't go on to the next level of education. And so, how do we change those systems? And one of the main ideas is that systems are made up of people. So, when we change people, we can change systems. So, how do we do that? All right. Every time I go to click next, it doesn't go. There we go. Okay. So why even have an upgrade? So I kind of already mentioned that. Um, Maybe we can drop in the chat if you've had trauma-informed training in the past. Maybe drop a number one or a yes or a thumbs up if you've had trauma-informed care training in the past. Has anyone had trauma-informed care training in the past? Looking in the chat. Anyone? Anyone? Yes. Okay, cool. One. Anyone else? Unfortunately not. Okay. First time. Yes. All right. Yes. Good. Good. So we have a few yeses and then we have a few first times. Got a thumbs up. Great. First time. So I'm curious, and not to put people on the spot, but maybe in the chat, drop in something that you learned or something that you do differently. So I'll give a second to see if someone comes up with an idea around how their trauma-informed training changed the way they do social work or changed the way they interact with other people, or something that you remember from that training that really, really stuck with you. I'm going to wait a minute and see what pops up in the chat there. Are they able to unmute, or are we just one way mostly?
I
Let's,
believe Kim would be able to answer that. I see I can
okay.
allow others to come in.
It's okay. We have a couple of things coming in here. I just wasn't sure if that was
Okay.
gonna work. Something I learned, let's see. Something I learned is to approach clients with empathy instead of sympathy. Love that. That's a great idea. I appreciate that. Empathy instead of sympathy. So the idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes as opposed to just feeling bad for someone else. A student's challenging behavior typically communicates what the student may not be able to. Very good. Yeah. Behavior tells us a lot about what's really going on beneath the surface. Ooh, flipping your lid. Yes. Good job, Saul. Yes. That idea of you lose some of your thinking brain. We're going to talk about that. I'm able to offer a lot more grace and generosity, knowing that people are being the best they can. Love that. Good, good, good. Before I react to someone's negative behavior, take a moment to think about their ACEs score. Yes, very good. Cool. So these are some great ideas. I'm glad that you took something away from previous trainings. A lot of times when I ask that question, I get blank stares. And that's where I was like, okay, we need to dive deeper, or we need to change the conversation or change the perspective to make sure that you're walking out of this conversation with some tangible things that you can do and ways that you can remember some of these concepts. So I appreciate that feedback. One of the things that I always say at the beginning of training is you're in this conversation a lot of times because of the work that you're doing. And these concepts are definitely applicable in work, but they're also applicable everywhere you are, in every relationship, in every conversation. So I always really encourage people to, yes, think how I can apply this at work and my job and my career, but also I always like to tell people that the more I've learned about this information and these concepts, the more it's changed me as a partner, as a brother, as a dad, in so many ways, not just in my professional life. So I encourage you to think about that as we're looking at these concepts. How can you apply them not only in your work, but also in your daily life and in your relationships? All right. So I wanted to kind of give I kind of already went through this. So let's just keep going and really talk about how we're going to change our mindset, not just adding more content. So the overall goal of this conversation, one of the things that I like to also point out is I'm used to doing a 6-hour certification class. So when I'm asked to do a 45-minute session, I really have a hard time zoning in on very specific topics. So I'm going to do my best to get through the slides and leave some time for Q&A. But if you're ever interested, I'll have our contact information at the end. But it would be great to have you involved in a longer conversation where we do a deeper dive on a lot of these concepts. So our goal for today is to really connect the idea of personal regulation, right? How you regulate yourself to relation-centered practice. So how do you regulate yourself? And then how do you relate to other people? And then again, how do we take that into a bigger idea around community level healing? Because I love this sentence right here, systems shape nervous systems. So I was going to open it up and ask, can someone kind of talk through that idea? But I'm going to go ahead and just do that. So systems shape nervous systems. Um, One of the examples that I can give with this is school. So you're all participating in this conversation through Fresno Pacific University. And so that is a system. Some of you may have come to that system with previous experiences at an educational institution where maybe you experienced trauma. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but your brain is a predictive machine based on your previous experiences. So when you enrolled at Fresno Pacific University, all of the previous educational experiences you've had, or even all of the religious experiences you've had, since it is a religious fundamental institution, came into this system and it impacts your nervous system. So, one of the things we really focus on in this trauma-informed conversation is this idea of safety. And we want to talk about psychological and emotional safety and physical safety. So you could come to this campus and maybe you had a negative experience on the Fresno State campus. And now you come to this campus, your nervous system has been shaped by your previous experiences at another educational campus. So you're bringing that to this system. And it's really interesting to kind of think about how you navigate a system based on your previous experiences. And so, again, we can apply that to all kinds of different systems and sectors. So maybe you're going to a new doctor. All of the experiences you've previously had have led up to this moment that you're going to a new doctor. So your brain is going to predict, your nervous system is going to predict whether it's going to be a safe space or a not safe space. It's really interesting to think about that when you're working with folks and when you're going places yourself. Um, the goal is really to shift from identifying trauma to building conditions for healing, whether in individuals, teams, or neighborhoods. And so in the past, someone mentioned ACEs. If you're not familiar with ACEs, there's this whole body of research about adverse childhood experiences. And for a long time, that was a big part of the conversation, and it still is, because it's really important to understand how trauma and childhood experiences have shaped us and who we are today. But again, we really want to come away from the idea about focusing on the trauma to shifting to a focus on healing and building things like resilience and how do we respond now based on our experiences in the past. So the length that we're going to look at things through today, of course, neuroscience, I've talked about that and how our brains and bodies respond to stress and safety. Let's talk a little bit about evolution and why we have this threat detection and belonging and how those things drive our behavior. I'm going to talk a little bit about language. As I mentioned, experiences matter, relationships matter, and words matter. And so our language matters also. I'm going to talk a little bit more about systems and how the policies and practices that are in these systems, again, shape our nervous systems and how that works together. And then again, at the end of the day, the goal is really practical everyday shifts that you can leave with and use after this session. All right. Oh, I went in the other direction. Okay, let's see. So the mechanism of this shift really are those three ideas around experiences matter, relationships matter, and words matter. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about what those mean. But I encourage you to start thinking about that. What do we mean by experiences, relationships, and words? And spoiler alert, it's all about how our brains and our bodies work and how they respond to the outside world and our internal world. So we're going to start with some brain basics. So like I said, neuroscience for normal people. This is a very, 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 very oversimplified model of the human brain. It's really valuable to have this simplified model for this conversation. Hopefully, you've gotten some education around your brain. It always worries me at times. I don't think there's enough of this conversation in our regular everyday education. So I'm really hoping that we can start to teach kids early on more about their big, beautiful brains. And I like to boil it down to your brain has three main jobs. Your survival brain is really just evolved to keep you alive. We could go a lot deeper and talk about fight or flight, fawn and freeze, all of those types of automatic responses that are happening in our survival brain, which is that red area towards the bottom. And that's the first part of our brain to develop. And then the next job of our brain is to keep us connected. So that's where our midbrain, that yellow region in there, is all about emotions and relationships. And then the last part of our brain to develop is our prefrontal cortex, which is the stuff right behind our forehead. And those are the parts of our brain, the network that really deal with logic and reasoning. So whenever I do trainings with teachers, I help them start to understand that I know you want kids to learn, but if they don't feel connected and they don't feel safe, their brains literally might not be able to do the things that they want it to. They can't learn if they don't feel safe and connected first. So a little bit more about these different parts of our brains. So like I said, the survival brain is the first part of our brain to develop. The next part of our brain is our emotional brain, and that's where we have feelings and attachment. I just had a conversation today with someone about the current immigration difficulties that we're having in our nation and how families are being separated, and how does that affect children and parents and their attachment to each other. The last part of our brain to develop is our thinking brain. And this is where we do all these things like being on Zoom, language, the concept of time, all of these things are happening in our logical thinking brain. And the funny thing that I like to point out to folks is that if we were to do a show of hands, how many of you feel like you're very logical creatures and you're constantly using logic to make decisions and things like that? And usually a lot of hands go up. But what we really know about our brains, and we look at human behavior and we look at MRIs and things, we really see that we're very emotional creatures. We all like to think that we're very logical and we have good reasoning, which we do for the most part, but it's also very, very important to remember that our emotions are what really, really drive us so often. Um, in a longer conversation, we would talk about default and automatic behaviors, and a lot of those are our survival brain doing its job, and a lot of our emotional brain doing its job as well. And then hopefully our thinking brain also gets involved. And again, this is a very oversimplified model. Your brain is not in these distinct sections. Our network of our brains, we've learned, are very, very active almost all the time. We used to think that when we went to sleep, because we were unconscious, that our brains were turning off. And we now know that our brains are doing phenomenal work, processing waste and reorganizing memories when we're sleeping. So really, really interesting to know and continue to learn about what's really going on in our brains. And this brings me to one of the first strategies that I want you to take with you. And this strategy was developed by Dr. Bruce Perry, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But the strategy is in stressful situations or intense situations, the strategy is regulate, relate, and then reason. So we usually think, oh, I have a problem to solve, so I'm just going to start thinking about it and just dive in. Or maybe I'm having a conversation with someone, and maybe it's an emotional conversation. We really just think that, oh, we can think our way out of the situation. And what we really want to try and do is reverse that and know that if we regulate our nervous system, maybe by taking a deep breath, right? That kind of thing. And then relate. Okay, who's involved in this conversation? How do I feel connected to this conversation and the people that I'm working with right now? And then we can reason and really think through and get through a tough decision, that sort of thing. So really, really reversing that kind of process can really help us. Um, and that idea of taking a deep breath, there's a whole list of things we can do. Hopefully, you've heard of your vagus nerve. And so your vagus nerve is connected at the very bottom of that brainstem, and it goes through our entire body. And this is where a lot of our early experiences are shaped. And if you've ever heard, there's a great book that I'm going to recommend later and show you. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And your vagus nerve is what really is a part of that system that's keeping the score. So whenever we experience traumatic experiences or stressful situations, that whole nervous system responds in such a way that we really do keep the score of our past experiences. And again, we would talk way more about that in a longer conversation. Moving on. So, a little bit about the evolution of us as human beings over time. We've been on this earth for thousands of years, and our brains have evolved in small groups, not these giant cities. Fresno County has 1 million people. For thousands of years, we were in small tribes that would travel together around and hunting and gathering and those sorts of things. And so the biggest concern was, am I safe? So our brains were constantly scanning, am I safe? Am I going to get eaten by a predator? And the other thing is, am I accepted? Because the worst thing that could happen is social rejection. So there's a great show on TV that's still around. I think there's like 20 or 30 seasons of survival. Um, Hopefully you've seen or you know what survival is. But the whole idea is people are trying to survive in the wild, but at the end of the show, someone gets kicked off the island. And so that's the last thing you want. You don't want to get kicked off the island because then you can't win the $1 million or whatever. So this idea, I think, is really stuck with us as humans because we're constantly trying to evaluate, do I fit in? Am I still in a group so that I can survive? But our social structures have changed so much now that we're exposed to so many more people. But it's really interesting to think about how that has created some of the behaviors that we still engage in today. One of the other things we really want to talk about is that behavior is often seen as bad, or we say that people are making bad choices. I think about the whole substance use disorder and addiction work that people are doing. Survival is really what's going on in those situations. How do I survive in these situations? And so again, that's an evolution of our brains over time, developing survival strategies and coping mechanisms that work in certain situations and at certain ages. But you've probably heard people say, how is that coping mechanism or that survival strategy working for you now? Again, in a longer conversation, we would talk about an experience maybe of a 5-year-old and how they interacted with their parents as a 5-year-old would be one way to survive in that situation. And sometimes at the age of 25, we might go back to that 5-year-old behavior in a new relationship because it helped us survive when we were 5, but we haven't necessarily practiced or learned new strategies for the age of 25 and the current people that we're interacting with. But when we're in a stressful situation, our brain reverts back to those earlier automatic behaviors. So that's one of the beauties of going through therapy is talking about, oh, how's that working for you now, right? That might have worked really well when you were a 5-year-old and your parents were doing this or that. Now that you're 25 and you're interacting with your partner, that same behavior might be your automatic behavior, but is it going to serve you in this current situation? So interesting to think about. Another question that we often used to ask is, what's wrong with this person or why are they like this? And now we really want to shift to this question of what does their nervous system think is happening right now? Um, the whole concept of time is really interesting when you learn about the human brain. Um, Things like a diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Someone is reliving a traumatic experience in the current moment as if it's happening right now. Some of the healing modalities that we're going to talk about can help them shift their brain and rewire their brain so that they can be more aware of what's happening in this moment, as opposed to thinking that this traumatic situation that they previously experienced is still what they're experiencing. today. All right. So now I want to kind of dive into this idea of what matters. So experiences matter. The reason I landed on experiences matter, hopefully you've heard of this concept called neuroplasticity. And that's really just the idea. We used to think that our brains were mostly solid and kind of like cement, and not very malleable or changeable. But what we now know because of things like MRIs, functioning MRIs, magnetic resonance imagery, all these new technologies that we have, we know that our brains are much more like plastic and they can be molded and shaped. And so the idea of experiences matter is that experiences literally wire our neural pathways. This conversation is a perfect example. Some of you have heard some of these concepts before. So this current conversation is reactivating some of the connections and the wires that you already had in your brain. So then you'll be able to remember these things later on. And then for some of you who haven't heard these concepts in this way, your brain is making new connections. So this is why experiences matter, because of the way that our brains work. There's a great phrase that Dr. Dan Siegel talks about, and it's what fires together wires together. So that idea that the way our brains work, when we're experiencing something, our brain is making those connections between all of the neurons. Chronic stress, basically, this idea around chronic stress is that when we're experiencing chronic stress, that's continued stress over time, we spend more time in our survival brain and less access to our learning brain. So I'm going to show you a diagram later on that illustrates this really well. But again, if you think about it, if you're in your survival brain all the time, there's a great phrase in the sports industry, use it or lose it. And our brains are very much like a muscle. And so if we're using our survival brain all of the time and we're constantly under stress, our survival brain is going to be very strong and very reactive to situations, as opposed to our learning brain. So it's really interesting, and I'll show you this illustrated later on, but that's really how our brains get shaped for later on. Adversity stacks. So this is the idea that some of these things on this list here, poverty, racism, instability, violence, and exclusion, these are adverse situations that compound and stack on our personal experiences. So this is why the ACEs research was so important, because we understood finally that those adverse child experiences, they do have a direct impact on not only our emotional and psychological health, but our physical health. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But yes, this idea that the more doses of these that we have, the more damaging it can be, and the more it definitely shapes and changes our brains for later on. But also, the good news is that positive experiences also help us build resilience. And so there was a lot of conversations about ACEs and adverse child experiences. But what we really want to also say is your ACE score is not your destiny. Just because you've had a very challenging, difficult childhood, if you've also had positive experiences and positive supportive relationships, the difficulties and the adversities that you've had in the past might not have as huge of an impact on you throughout the rest of your life, which is great, great news. And that's why some of the strategies that I'm going to talk about are all about building positive experiences and positive relationships. Consistent caring adults are huge, huge impact on children. Again, when I worked at CPS, I saw this all the time. The impact of kids that were being moved from home to home to home was really, really disrupting their ability to maintain relationships. And so these kids turn 25, 26, and they've left the foster care system, and they're still struggling all the time. And finally, we can really see that it's because they didn't have consistent caring adults and the impact that that has on how their brain is wired for relationships. I see kids like that are now 25 and 26. They can get a job, but they can't keep a job. They can find an apartment, but they can't keep an apartment. They can start a relationship with someone, but they can't keep that relationship with someone. So it's really, really interesting to see how, again, that inconsistency or instability early on has shaped their brains for this challenging experience later on. Another really important thing is predictable routines and predictable environments, moments of success and joy and dignity. And the real takeaway here is what we do repeatedly becomes our nervous system template. So again, if you think about a child that was experiencing poverty and racism and instability and maybe the foster care system, and you think about how their brain is wired for later on, they had lots of survival situations that they had to constantly use their survival brain. And so their thinking brain isn't necessarily as active and as logical. So it's really interesting that they see how those repeated behaviors and those repeated experiences shape the nervous system over time. So that's experiences matter. The next one is relationships matter. And so, if we go back to this idea of evolution over time and getting kicked out of the group and not belonging, that's where relationships really, really matter for us. When a human child is first born, it takes at least a year, sometimes more, sometimes less, for a baby to learn how to walk. So that baby is dependent on the caregivers that are around it. So that's why inconsistent caregivers really do shape a child's brain because they start to interpret the world as unsafe because they don't have these strong supportive relationships. As I look through here, the systems angle here is we don't serve people one to one. We serve them through relationships and policies and spaces. So again, just that idea that thinking of a school as a system and how all of the policies and relationships at that school impact you as a student or as a community member who's working with the school. It's really interesting to think how important relationships are to us in our personal lives and in our external community lives and our neighborhoods and all those sorts of things. And then the reminder here is really that systems shape nervous systems. And the last one is words matter. I'm going to kind of push through here to make sure we have time for a Q&A. One of my favorite sayings, I have it on this next slide, is sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Hopefully you've heard that. And that's totally backwards. So that's really this idea that we are narrative creatures as human beings. So the words that we use to communicate, even internally, really shape who we are. Um, there's lots and lots of examples of just using a sentence or a phrase and repeating it in our own heads, not even saying it out loud, and then measuring your pulse or your cortisol rate or your heart rate even. We can see these chemical and biological changes just on words and thoughts. So it's really, really important to pay attention to the words that we use with people. And we honor the power of language and the power of words. Um, some of these threatening languages on this slide are this idea, oh, you need to calm down, right? I'm sure we've all told someone, hey, can you just calm down? That usually doesn't go well, right? We need to remember that things that we say really have an impact on other people. Safety language we can use is, man, I can see this is a lot. Let's slow down together. So that's a way of de-escalating a situation. Wow, this is a lot. There's a lot going on. Let's slow down together. And if you think again about regulate, relate, reason, this is a perfect example, right? We're validating and then we're saying, okay, let's slow down together. Really interesting, right? So in the threatening language, it was you need to calm down. But in the safety language, it's let's slow down together. So that's that relational piece that's really, really important. Um, Another example here is given everything you've been carrying, your reaction makes sense. So I think about this when you're out and you're working with the community, and maybe someone comes in and you're working at a food bank and you say, "Oh, okay, hey, can you fill out this information real quick for us and then we'll get you your food." And someone says, "Oh, I don't want to fill out your darn forms. Like, I just want my food." Someone who isn't trauma informed, hasn't been through this conversation, be like, okay, well, you can get in the back of the line, like until you calm down, right? You need to calm down. But what would be great is to really think about, okay, whew, you've been carrying a lot. You're here for food. Um, sure, there's a lot going on. It totally makes sense that you don't want to fill out this piece of paper. Unfortunately, this is part of our process. So, how can we help you take a moment and reset? And maybe we can reset together, and then we'll get to the next step. So, thinking about those kinds of things is really important. The words we use with people really, really matter. There's a lot of power in the words that we use. Sometimes I'll ask for examples of just one or two words that really either sends shivers down our spine, or an example of when someone used a word about you and all of a sudden you felt a certain way, and you didn't even realize that that word meant so much to you. But it really, really does. And it's wild to think about the chemicals that course through our veins when we feel threat, and a word can put us there. Especially in the current political climate. Someone says snowflake, and that means has so many convoluted meanings these days. And again, we want to think that, oh, it's just words, it's not a big deal. But that's just not the case for us as human creatures. We're narrative creatures, and words and language mean a lot to us. So remember, words matter. All right. So a little bit about brain development. So I did want to bring up, this is a pull, an image from Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model. And what I really just wanted to show here was what I would say is a normal, typically developed brain versus a brain that has grown up and experienced ongoing chronic stress or chronic trauma. So what you see here is you see a quote unquote normal brain where your big thinking brain on the top is pretty well developed. So maybe you get into a car accident and all of a sudden you go into survival brain, but you're quickly able to regulate your system and then start to think about, okay, wow, what do I need to do next? Whereas if you experience significant trauma, your survival brain might be the most active part of your brain. So you might get into a car accident and you can't slow down your breathing, and you're still very reactive, and you're kind of stressing out, and you're very emotional, right? So just a couple of different examples of the different ways that our brains might be wired for thinking or for survival, and our emotional brains in the middle. So you can go and get a whole education and certification program through Dr. Perry's neurosequential model of care. Phenomenal, phenomenal work. I'm a huge fan. I have a couple of his books listed later on. But I really love this visual. And maybe you can even think about the next time you're in a stressful situation, maybe remember this picture and talk to yourself and say, okay, whew, am I like in survival brain or emotional brain? Or am I in my good thinking brain? And how do I get to my good thinking brain? Because I need to make a big decision. And so then maybe you can use some of these strategies. Best strategy ever is just taking a few deep breaths, maybe box breathing, right? Where you inhale for 4 clicks, and then you hold for 4 clicks, and you breathe out for 4 clicks. That literally just resets your entire neurological system. Because you know what you can't do if you're truly in a threatening situation? You can't do box breathing, right? So these are simple ways, even taking a sip of water. You know what you can't do if you're seriously under threat? You can't just swallow water easily. So that's a great way. If you have a kid that's kind of losing it and they're popping off, say, hey, let's like take a drink, real quick sip of water, and let's take a deep breath. Completely changes their whole neurological system. I do see a question about copies of the slides. Yes, I will definitely send copies of the slides to the doctors here. All right, so shifting our mindset. Couple ideas around these four anchor words. Context is very important, and we locate distress in conditions, not just individuals. So this is again is that idea of a systemic type of situation. Um, I think about racism when I think about context. A lot of times we say that that person is that way because of their race. And really, what we should take a step back from is the context. How is the context shaped how their experience is as an individual, but within the context of their interactions? Another really important thing is power. Who has control? Whose voice counts? Again, these are big conversations that are coming out right now in our political system. Um, right, we're supposed to have this idea in the United States that everyone has their voice and we have the right to free speech and these things. And it's really been interesting to see how that's shaping up these days, and how that impacts our neurological system and whether we feel safe or threatened. Culture is also a very important piece of this conversation. What kind of environments and relationships did you grow up in has a huge impact on who you are today and how you interact with people. And then that last idea is around the collective. How do we heal together and work together and those sorts of things? Um, I'm going to push through a couple of slides here because I want to get to a little bit of Q&A. So I really wanted to call this out. Yes, please continue on your individual healing journey and your internal voice and your internal conversations, and also focus on your external relationships. I really hope to see more community healing where people are coming together. We have so much more in common than we do different. We really should be focusing on the things we have in common, and that's how we really can lead to systems change. The work that we're doing in these different systems can change by the perspectives of each individual. And when it comes to building resilience and relieving some stress, our California Surgeon General a couple of years posted this and issued this in a 400-page document. So I pulled this very specific thing. I encourage you to get doses of these things throughout your day and set some goals around these things throughout the next month or the next 2 months, especially with the holidays coming. Physical activity, of course. There's research that shows lower rates of dementia later on in life if you had just 10 minutes of walking per day. So physical activity is super, super important for our brains. When I think of mindfulness practices, I specifically want to call this out with prayer. Some people think that, oh, meditation is what we're talking about with mindfulness, and prayer is a form of meditation. It's those kinds of things where you're connecting to something bigger than yourself, right? And some of your values and belief systems. Really, really important. So I encourage you to look at these things and set some goals. Hopefully you have some of these things already going on. I always encourage people, like I have 4 or 5 plants in my office now, because I know that the color green and being in nature provides some stress relief. So I really encourage small things like that. We can get small doses of healing and those kinds of things throughout our day. We don't just have to have these big, big goals. All right. Here are some great books that I highly recommend and some authors. There's The Body Keeps the Score. That's Bruce Perry's most recent book that he wrote with Oprah. I'm not sure if you've heard of Oprah, kind of an important book person. If you're interested in the addiction field, I highly, highly, highly recommend Dr. Gabor Mate, phenomenal work that he's doing in the addiction field. Brene Brown is another phenomenal researcher and person that is very involved in these conversations. And then our own California Surgeon General was Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. She has a book called The Deepest Well. She also has a phenomenal TED Talk that's been watched millions and millions of times about adverse childhood experiences. And then My Grandmother's Hands is specifically about racialized trauma. So if you're interested in that topic, I highly, highly recommend My Grandmother's Hands. Also, one of my favorite websites to subscribe to is the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. If you like working with kids and families, that is such a great resource. And you can go to the Harvard Center for the Developing Child website. There's some great videos, lots of great things there. And that's it. If you want to scan that QR code, that is a link to our Brainwise Instagram. As was mentioned, we now have, we do training, we do the 6-hour certification. We have a parenting class that we do, and we're also offering free yoga here at our office a few times each week. So please check us out on Instagram and our website. You can text me, highly available, very interested in having these conversations with folks. And that's it. I want to open it up for some Q&A. And like I said, I will forward the slides over to the folks to get to everyone.
Thank you so much, Jason, for this really thorough, informative, information in just an hour's time. So I know that was a lot to put in an hour, but it was really really good information. So thank you. We do have a couple of questions. Just a comment. Evelina mentioned she put a garden in her office, which is wonderful. And we have one of our professors asked a policy question in the Q&A. What specific strategies for policy change do you recommend to effectively integrate trauma-informed care in daily practice and service?
That is a great question. One of the best things is reflective practice, especially if it's in a clinical setting. The idea of having a safe space that people can come to and talk about the things that are weighing heavy on them. A lot of businesses and organizations don't have an appropriate level of supervision and support. Also, peer support is really, really valuable. So those are kinds of policy changes that we can implement in a lot of different structures in a lot of different ways, because we really have to fight this idea that when I come to work, I leave all that other stuff at home. I think that is something that was developed a long, long time ago. And if you know about human beings, you don't just take your brain and your heart out and leave them on your desk and you go home. And then when you get home, right, you put in your home brain and heart. That's not the way we work as human beings. So the more we can have space for people to integrate who they truly are as human beings in the workplace and in business, I think that's where the trauma-informed care can really come in. And raising your awareness that people have had experiences that shape who they are today. Awareness is the thing that I really, really focus on in this longer conversation, is self-awareness and awareness of others is a huge first step to implementing trauma-informed care.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. We have Brianna who says, I work for a nonprofit organization that works with students in the after school setting. Since the brain is always asking, am I safe and am I accepted? What are subtle ways that adults can communicate safety and belonging in daily interactions? How can I teach staff to
Mm.
practically shift from identifying trauma to building conditions for healing within their classrooms and on our teams?
Oh,
Great
I love
question.
that. That is a great question. Um, and with kids, it's really interesting. It's these little things like I used to work with one of the principals at one of our very, very challenging schools. And it was a simple thing where he would stand at the front gate and just fist bump or even give some handshakes to the kids coming in the door. And that's right, that's a physical connection as well as a I see you connection. And saying, I see you, I'm glad you're here. that's the other part of this conversation is it doesn't have to be these big grand gestures. It's just those human level connections. Um, I always encourage do your best to try and learn people's names. If you haven't heard of the cocktail party effect, there can be all kinds of chaos going on, and someone says Jason, all of a sudden my brain hears just that one word because that's my name. Our names are very important to us as human beings. So learning kids' names early on. How do you want me to pronounce your name? Little things like that seem small, but for some people, it's their entire identity, is how you pronounce their name. And being vulnerable, I think, is the other big piece. Being vulnerable with kids and saying, I'm struggling with this too. This is really hard for me also. And apologies. Apologies go a long way. I love when I teach a class and I say, how many of you had your parents ever apologize for something? And no hands go up. And it's like, okay, parents, what are we doing? Like, we gotta say, hey, I'm a human too. I messed up. I'm sorry. That goes a long way with kids because they're not hearing adults say that they're sorry. It's kind of wild. But if you think about it, when's the last time you heard an adult apologize to their kiddo or apologize to someone else? Like, we got to model that because we expect that from kids. Say you're sorry. We're real good at saying that. But have you ever said, oh, I'm sorry too? So those are some ideas. That physical connection, of course, you have to be careful with physical connection and touch, but like, again, a little fist bump, little pat on the back. Proximity is another thing that we talk about in the education system, just being close to someone. Here's the big one. Eye to eye contact. Please, please stop doing this whole, you look me in the eye when I'm talking to you. That's aggressive behavior from animals, right? If you sit next to someone and say, "Hey, we have a really important conversation we need to have," as opposed to looking directly at them, it's very intimidating. So those are some ideas around how to implement some of these things. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We do have a question. We have time for just one more, and it's
Mm,
probably going to be really quick if possible.
yes.
Um, just want to, honor people's time here. But Gabriel's asking, how does prayer heal or soothe you? And a
Mm,
similar question, I guess you could tack on to that. Our faculty, Professor Muinotua asked, how does faith and spirituality fit with trauma-informed care?
definitely, definitely. Um, some of our basic physiological mechanisms. One of a great way to calm our vagus nerve is humming. Mm, because it vibrates and it calms our vagus nerve. So when I think about prayer and I think about chanting, and just that self conversation, even if it's internal, right? A lot of times prayer is in silence and it's internal. Those types of conversations, again, help us feel safe. Hopefully, your religion and your practice and your prayer is because you're devoted to a system that you feel safe in. So again, it's all about that idea of emotional safety, psychological safety, and hopefully physical safety as well. So those are the kinds of things I think. Um, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, thank you. I mean, definitely like meditation, prayer can be very grounding,
yeah,
when your thoughts are going in different
yeah,
directions, right? So it's kind of
yeah,
anchoring in some ways when you're able to
yeah.
pray. So thank you so much.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. The other thought, real quick, was the idea of let go and let God, right? That's a releasing of stress and literally saying, okay, someone else handled this stressful situation, so I'm gonna let it go. I can't do anything about it. I'm let Jesus take the wheel. That kind of
Mm.
those kinds of sayings really catch on in a lot of different conversations and
Yeah.
ways. So
Thank
yeah,
you so much, Jason. I appreciate your information and just being here present with us to just give this important presentation to our students and our partners here. And yeah, thank you all for joining. Just remember that you'll receive an email that lets you know that of the next date, which will be in February, as these are quarterly Learn at Lunches. And we thank you again. If you didn't get a chance to put your name in the chat and just give us an idea of where you're coming from, if you're an MSW, BSW student, or from an agency representing an agency, please feel free to do that. We thank you again and appreciate you joining us for this Learn at Lunch series. God bless you.